last speaker of the session is Becket Ebitz from, actually, why I
University
don't
of
find
Minnesota.
where you're from. University of Minnesota.
Yeah,
Thank
University
you.
of Minnesota.
Thanks.
Okay. All right, so I'm Becket Ebitz, and I'm going to talk about how I think we explore, so how we discover new solutions or new opportunities in a complicated and changing world. So by way of starting, I want to say that one thing we know is that neural activity tends to follow repeated goal-dependent patterns across trials. So here I'm illustrating a bunch of traces that I recorded from the frontal eye fields of a rhesus macaque. So this is a region that's involved in decision-making and sensorimotor control. And for these traces, the task that the monkey had was very simple, just choose left or right. And then I've just colored the traces based on whether the monkey ultimately chose the target on the left or the right. And you can see that you get these sort of tight, repeated patterns of firing rate across here session or trial averaged traces. So another way of representing this pattern across neurons is as trajectories through a neural state space, right? So here, every sort of point corresponds to the combined firing of these three neurons that I've plotted here. And what we can see here again in this view is that neural activity seems to be confined to these low-dimensional, goal-dependent trajectories now through neural state space. And one sort of possible explanation for these kinds of effects is that the network implements some low-dimensional dynamic attractor that constrains how neural activity evolves over time. So much as a sort of water slide might reliably route children from the top of some platform into a pool, following the same trajectory over and over again, there might be forces within the network due to the connectivity of the network, due to its inputs, that constrain how neural activity evolves over time. So this is really useful in any circumstance where you want to reliably move activity from one place to another, right? You don't want the children to fall off the side, and you also want to sort of constrain how activity can evolve if you're trying to implement working memory, if you're trying to implement reliable decisions. For timing, executive control, there are really a lot of circumstances where you would want tightly controlled neural activity. But there are also circumstances when you might not. So sometimes we don't know precisely what our goals should be. Sometimes we want to try stuff out and see what works out for us. So in changing or uncertain environments, we have to balance the exploitation of a well-learned, established policy with the exploration of alternative policies. We need some mechanism that allows us to sample other ways of being in the world. And today I'm going to argue that part of how we explore is by disrupting these constraints, by disrupting these low-dimensional dynamics that route neural activity from one place to another. So in order to do that, we need to get monkeys now to explore and exploit. To do that, we're going to use a very simple, canonical explore-exploit task, the Restless K-armed bandit. So from the monkey's perspective, his job is very simple. He fixates a central fixation, two eccentric targets come up. The monkey makes a saccade to one of those targets, at which point we either reward him or don't reward him. And what makes this an explore-exploit task is the probability of reward for choosing each of those options. So you can see that the probability of choosing target 2 starts out really good, right? But it walks slowly and independently of target 1 over time. So at any moment in time, one or the other could be better. The longer you go without sampling one of the targets, the less certain you are as to its value. So it could have gotten better than some focal option at any point. So to solve this task, the monkey has to balance those two goals. If he finds a good, rewarding target, he has to sample it frequently because he's thirsty. But he also has to occasionally sample the other one because at any point it could get better than whatever he's focused on in the moment. And that's sort of exactly what the monkeys do in this task. So I've just put up a bunch of little dots here illustrating what choice the monkeys actually made. And you can see that when target 2 started out good, he chose target 2 fairly frequently. But at no point do they just end up only choosing target 2. Even though target 2 is quite a bit better than target 1, the monkey still continues to sample target 1, right? So he's exploring as well as he's exploiting in the task. So to answer our central question, now we have to figure out when the monkey was exploring and when he was exploiting and somehow label these trials. And I don't have the time to get into the details of this right now, but we have developed a method for doing this that we reported in our paper from last year. where we model these as the latent states underlying the sequence of choices. And when we do that, we sort of end up labeling explore choices as these choices. So these are the sort of samples that occur between long runs of choosing the same target over and over again. And I just want to stress that this is not synonymous with whether a decision is a switch or stay decision. This isn't related to the reward value or the difference in the reward values between the options. It's related, it's not synonymous, I should say. And these labels do a pretty good job of explaining neural activity. So the other thing that we did in this paper was we recorded from neurons in the frontal eye fields. And typically in the frontal eye fields, you see exactly what I was sort of showing you before. You can predict the choice the monkey's going to make from the activity of single neurons. Here you can see the firing rate when they're going to choose the target that's in the receptive field is higher than when they're going to choose the other target. But these are the trials that we labeled as the exploit trials. If we look at the trials that we labeled as the explore trials, you can see that we can't really predict what choice the monkey's going to make anymore from the single neuron, right? So that choice predictive information seems to go away. And what I want to argue today is that we think this is occurring because the forces in the network that cause this kind of selectivity, that this selectivity is a consequence of those dynamics, are actually weakened during exploration. And that permits the noise necessary for exploratory choice. So if that hypothesis is correct, two things should be observable in the data. Neural activity should be more variable. If it's less constrained, if there are fewer forces sort of causing it to live in a small amount of space, then it should be free to sort of move more often between trials or over time within a trial. And the second thing is that brain and behavior should be easier to perturb. So if my perturbation isn't fighting so much with the intrinsic constraints which are forcing neural activity back against my perturbation, then it should be easier to sort of take an identical perturbation and cause neural activity to escape some local minima into some new space. So those are our predictions. I'll start with this first one. So for single neurons, we measure the variability of their activity, very typically with the Fano factor, right? So this is the Fano factor aligned to target onset. We see the quenching at target onset that we sort of expect to see from Mark Churchland's work. Here, this is what it looks like during exploitation. During exploration, we see a similar pattern, but it's actually elevated, right? So there's more variability in single neurons. The other feature I want to draw your attention to is that the time that it takes to recover from that initial perturbation is actually longer during exploitation compared to exploration. This is true both on average and within the single neurons by themselves. And this is important because we know from theoretical work that this sort of exact result, this delay to recovery from a perturbation, is what we would expect if the constraints on the network are somehow weakened. We can also measure how sort of coordinated the evolution of neural activity is across trials. So if all the trials are sort of subject to the same forces, they'll all move in the same direction. They'll be highly coordinated compared to if they aren't. And we can measure that during exploration and exploitation. So the dots tend to fall below the unity line, which means that there's less coordination during exploration compared to exploitation. We can also get much more specific about our predictions. We can use a model here, just sort of a two-pool competing accumulator attractor network model. We can set it up to always choose target 2 here, so we put strong forces into the network to push the traces to choose target 2 all the time. We can do the same thing, set it up to choose target 1, or we can set up the network to make decisions stochastically. So here, neural activity is sort of pushed towards this saddle node, and then it separates out just depending on that initial noise and wherever it was. It still makes decisions. But what we see when we sort of look at the trajectories, when we set up the model in these different ways with strong dynamics or weak dynamics, are a couple of different changes in the phenomenology of the trajectories. One is the speed at which the trajectories separate. So trajectories leading to different choices separate more quickly if the forces are stronger compared to if they're weaker. The second is that the initial noise actually really matters if the forces in the network are weaker. So if the forces aren't shoving all of the trajectories to the same ultimate endpoint, then a little bit of initial noise in your starting position propagates forward in time and ends up having a bigger impact on the ultimate choice. So to be really concrete, we make this sort of prediction that there should be some kind of a crossover where early on there's more separation during exploration, but that separation accelerates faster during exploitation. And that's exactly what we see in the data. So I'm going a bit long, I think, but Let's get to this next point. So brain and behavior should be easier to perturb if the forces fighting us are weaker. So in the FEF, we know exactly what effect perturbing neural activity should have. If we stimulate FEF, we get a reliable fixed vector retinotopically aligned saccades. We can measure their precision, and we can also integrate them into our K-armed bandit task. We can just arrange our two targets so that the stimulation vector is orthogonal to the plane of the target locations. And then when we stimulate, the monkeys will just complete their choice to whatever target they were going to look at. And then we can actually measure the sort of precision of the saccade that we evoked, whether or not we actually got a saccade at all, in the middle of this task while the monkeys are exploring and exploiting when we've labeled those states. So we can use the exact same model to make really specific predictions for what we would expect to see here. We do have to make a few changes. We have to change that sort of binary decision layer to a now continuous report so we can get a saccade vector out. And we have to add some pool that represents this third stimulated location. And when we do that, we find that if we sort of set up the network to sort of have weak constraints in it, it's actually easier to elicit a saccade. We sort of would have expected this a priori. But the precision of that saccade is also increased. So if the network isn't taking that current that we've injected into it and routing it into some unexpected outcome, we're getting more precise saccades every time we stimulate. So those are our predictions, and again, that's what we see in the data. So during exploration, we see that it's easier to elicit a saccade, so the same current is more likely to give us a saccade, and those resulting saccades are much more precise, both in that one example session and across a sort of large number of sessions at this point. So it does look like the FEF is actually easier to perturb during exploration, suggesting that the sort of intrinsic network forces that sort of frustrate our intended perturbation are weaker during this state. So just to conclude, the basic take-home is that I think that prefrontal activity is less constrained during activity, that the forces that typically sort of quench variability are weaker, and that's actually probably really useful when your goal is to be variable. And relaxing those constraints could be a really sort of simple, efficient way to increase the noise in neural activity and allow us to sort of sample new opportunities. So I think that's it for me. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I want to thank all the speakers for being remarkably on time and leaving time for questions. And I want to chastise the audience for being rather slow to come to the microphone and give them one last chance to show what they have. There's a question. Two questions. Great. The mic.
Yeah.
Sorry, it was far away from the mic. I was wondering, besides the analysis you show, which are very strong, had in mind, do you have a way to distinguish whether what you label as exploration isn't just like a change in attention in the... So I was trying to imagine your prediction seems to be possible to be applied also whether the animal is less focused on a given trial.
Yeah, I think for me, well, I'm recording in like an attentional control region, and what I'm seeing is that region is less predictive of the choice that the animal's making. So for me, that feels completely reasonable to say that maybe they're less focused during exploration. And maybe that's an important mechanism for exploration, that part of how we generate a little bit of behavioral noise is by randomizing our behavior with respect to these higher order policies that we have to sort of maintain online. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to go into this, but we do have some data that suggests that when these forces are weaker, you actually lose sort of top-down control over gaze. So they actually revert to being reflexive. So small perturbations of contrast or whatever have a bigger impact on decision making, which is consistent with the idea not that they're like zoned out and asleep or whatever else, but that we're selectively taking out this top-down information when we're weakening the constraints. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I guess attention is so many things, but now going back to the mechanism. So I thought this was really interesting and important. And one question I had was actually in FEF, at least at the single neuron level, it looked like there was less information and the neurons were overall more active. So the
Yeah.
ROC is lower while the overall firing higher. So in one simple-minded way to also think about this is that there are other inputs that project onto
Yeah.
the colliculus that would then have more influence, and
Yes.
while FEF actually has less influence, while overall making colliculus more kind of dumb and more fiery, so
Yeah.
to speak. So
Yeah.
if you can comment on that.
So I want to make a quick correction, which is we actually don't see any change in mean activity in the FEF. So the total net activity is absolutely conserved during exploration and exploitation. The change is the selectivity. Yeah, so, I'm sorry, yeah?
So the overall, so it's not like in your plot. I thought I
Oh.
saw overall higher.
Yeah, so this is one example neuron. It's
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
That's fine. That's fine.
somewhere, there it is, okay, yeah. So this one example neuron, it's slightly higher during exploration.
Yeah, for the out. But anyway,
the peak, yeah.
but on the colliculus front, do you think there's something like that going on,
Yeah.
or do you think that's
I like the subsumption story where the colliculus is doing these fast reflexive, we know that it's important for these expressicods, which take 50 milliseconds to generate, right? So the colliculus is this low-level reflexive circuit, and the FEF is sort of riding on top, right? So if the FEF wants to exert control over the oculomotor system, then implementing strong dynamics is a really good way of amplifying the information that's available to it and taking control over the oculomotor circuit that way. But the colliculus, I think, is always there because otherwise we would get poked in the eye or something terrible, yeah. Yeah. I'm sure there are worse things than being poked in the eye, but
Quick last question.
I was wondering how you thought this sort of relaxation of constraints related to more temporally extended environments where maybe the animal has to make like a concerted effort to cover ground or like go somewhere new.
yeah, that's a great question. I think, so I'm going to say everything is a subsumption architecture in the end, but I think that we need a sort of hierarchy of goals, and those involve a temporal hierarchy also, right? So if I have some long-term goal, like going to college or something, that probably involves some pretty complex reasoning that's very far in the prefrontal cortex, maybe. I've never seen a monkey go to college, so I'm assuming that this is a human thing. But those sorts of temporally extended goals, I think those are probably not something that you can implement by releasing the constraints on activity. If you have some temporally extended goal, but you also want to like see what you could do in this immediate period of time, then you might sort of randomize your behavior very briefly. But I'm definitely talking about this low-level like ways of randomizing behavior in this immediate timescale rather than the long. But that's a great question. Yeah.
Great talk, thank you.
Oh, thanks, Kim.
Thank you, audience. Thank you, Becket. Thanks for the session.